What if an entire town fell under the grip of demonic possession? Minds twisted, bodies convulsing, and chaos reigning as darkness spread. From cursed French convents to frenzied Italian villages, these are real, documented cases of mass possession where evil took control. Could you survive when the devil comes not for one, but for all? Discover the terrifying truth lurking behind history's most chilling outbreaks of demonic madness. You might never trust your own mind again. Chapter 1. The Madness of Loudun. The town of Loudun in the 1630s was a quiet, unsuspecting place. But what lurked beneath the surface was something far more sinister than the townspeople could ever have imagined. It began with whispers, subtle, unsettling whispers that echoed in the dim corridors of the Ursuline convent. It was here, behind the thick stone walls, that madness began to take hold. The first signs were strange. The nuns spoke of odd visions, nightmarish figures that slithered into their dreams, shadows that flickered just outside the reach of candlelight. Sister Jean de Angies, the Mother Superior, claimed that the devil himself had visited her. The more she spoke, the more the other nuns seemed to be infected with the same terrors. Soon, their bodies twisted in grotesque ways, contorting as if pulled by invisible hands. They screamed, their voices not their own, voices too deep, too guttural to belong to any woman. As the chaos spread, fingers began to point toward one man, Father Urbain Grandier. He was an arrogant priest, known as much for his intelligence and charm as for his enemies. He had made powerful adversaries in Loudun, and when the hysteria at the convent began, they seized the opportunity to rid themselves of him. The nuns accused Grandier of using witchcraft to send demons into their bodies. They claimed he had cursed them, using unholy rites to bind them to the devil. These accusations reached the ears of the local authorities, and the town, already a powder keg of tension and fear, erupted in madness. The possessed nuns convulsed violently in public, their bodies writhing on the cold stone floors of the church during Mass. Eyes rolled back into their heads, foaming at the mouth. They shouted obscenities that no pious woman would ever dare speak, and they cried out the name of Urbain Grandier over and over, as if his very mention brought the devil closer to them. Word of the Loudun possession spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered from surrounding villages, drawn by the lure of the grotesque spectacle unfolding in the convent. Public exorcisms were conducted by a stream of priests, each more desperate than the last to drive out the demons that had taken hold of these women. The exorcisms were horrifying affairs. The air inside the church was thick with incense and desperation. As the priests read from the holy texts, the nuns shrieked and spat, thrashing so violently that several were bound in chains to prevent them from injuring themselves or others. Their faces twisted into unnatural expressions of pure malevolence, eyes gleaming with an eerie, otherworldly light. Father Grandier, despite the accusations against him, maintained his innocence. He stood defiantly as the nuns accused him of cavorting with demons, his pride and self-assuredness never wavering. But the testimonies of the possessed were damning. They spoke of black masses, of strange rituals performed in the dead of night, of Grandier's pact with the devil himself. As the possessions grew more intense, the entire town of Loudun was pulled into the spiral of hysteria. People claimed to see dark shapes flitting through the streets at night, and some said they heard the cries of damned souls emanating from the convent. The line between the possessed and the spectators blurred as more and more residents of Loudun began to fear they, too, might fall victim to the evil forces that plagued the nuns. Local authorities, caught between their religious fervor and political interests, began to act. Grandier's enemies, who had long sought to bring him down, were quick to build a case against him. They accused him not only of sorcery, but of seducing the nuns and leading them into blasphemous acts. Their claims were bolstered by the spectacle of the nuns' possessions, a spectacle that grew more violent and more obscene with each passing day. Witnesses to the possessions provided chilling accounts. Some described seeing nuns crawl on their hands and knees, hissing like snakes, their bodies arching in ways that seemed to defy human anatomy. Others spoke of hearing the nuns speak in languages they could not possibly know, Latin, Greek, even Hebrew, fluently, in voices that bore no resemblance to their own. The smell of sulfur hung in the air, the unmistakable scent of hell itself. By 1634, the pressure to deal with Father Grandier reached a breaking point. A formal trial was convened, and despite his protests of innocence, Grandier was doomed from the start. The evidence was insurmountable. The testimonies of the possessed nuns, the town's mounting fear, and the desperate need for a scapegoat. His enemies, both religious and political, seized their chance. During the trial, more than 30 nuns testified against Grandier, claiming that he had appeared to them in visions, that he had summoned demons to possess them, and that he had used sorcery to control their minds and bodies. Grandier, in shackles, listened as the town's fury rained down upon him, his fate already sealed. Witnesses at the trial described the nuns' behavior as even more disturbing than before. They convulsed in the courtroom, shrieking his name and accusing him of every blasphemy imaginable. Despite the overwhelming pressure, Grandier continued to deny the charges, claiming he had done nothing wrong. But the crowd, the court, and the church had already decided his fate. On August 18, 1634, Urbain Grandier was sentenced to death. His punishment was brutal and swift. He was to be burned at the stake, a fate reserved for witches and heretics. As he was led to his execution, the town gathered to watch. The air was thick with the acrid smell of fear and hatred. As the flames rose around him, witnesses claimed that Grandier's final moments were eerily calm. He prayed aloud, insisting on his innocence even as the fire consumed him. Some said they heard screams not just from Grandier, but from the shadows around the pyre, as if the demons that had tormented Loudun were watching, waiting to claim their prize. The possessions in Loudun did not end immediately with Grandier's death. For months, the nuns continued to experience fits, convulsions, and visions. But gradually, the hysteria subsided, leaving behind only the charred remains of a man who had once been Loudun's priest, and a town forever marked by madness. The Loudun possessions became one of the most infamous cases of mass demonic possession in history. The town, once quiet and unremarkable, had become a place of fear, chaos, and death, where the line between the earthly and the infernal blurred, and where the devil himself seemed to have walked. Chapter 2. The Possessions of Würzburg. In the year 1629, in the midst of the dark turmoil of the 30 Years' War, the city of Würzburg, Germany, became gripped by an evil far more insidious than the bloodshed of battle. In this small, devout Catholic town, fear of the devil's hand crept into every corner. What began as whispers soon erupted into a firestorm of mass hysteria. The devil was not just a distant figure. He was present, they believed, within their very neighbors, children, and the streets they walked upon. This belief manifested itself in a series of horrific possessions and accusations, plunging Würzburg into one of the bloodiest which trials Europe had ever witnessed. It started with strange, unexplainable occurrences. A young girl, the daughter of a respected family, began to act in ways that could only be described as unnatural. Her body would convulse violently, limbs jerking with unnatural force as she screamed in voices that could not possibly be her own. At night, she was tormented by visions. Figures cloaked in shadow whispered dark secrets in her ear, urging her to renounce God. The local priests were summoned, and soon after, more children in the town began to display the same terrifying symptoms. The afflicted children, some as young as 8 years old, spoke of seeing the devil himself. They claimed he walked among them, disguising himself in familiar faces, even taking on the form of family members. Their descriptions were vivid: eyes black as coal, skin charred like burnt flesh, an overwhelming stench of sulfur clinging to him. And as the fear spread, so too did the accusations. These children were not merely ill. The townspeople believed they were possessed by demons, instruments of Satan sent to corrupt the innocent. Ruling over Würzburg at the time was Prince Bishop Philip Adolf von Ehrenberg, a man of intense religious fervor. For von Ehrenberg, there was no question that the devil had infiltrated his city. His solution was swift and brutal: purge Würzburg of this evil, and rid his flock of the witches who had made a pact with Satan to bring about such demonic possession. Von Ehrenberg's response was ruthless, driven by an unwavering belief in the righteousness of his cause. Under his orders, witch trials were quickly convened, and the accused were subjected to horrific tortures designed to force confessions. Anyone could be a witch, man, woman, or child, and no one was safe from the mounting paranoia that engulfed the city. Contemporary records describe the eerie atmosphere that descended upon Würzburg. The ringing of church bells was no longer a sign of salvation, but a death knell for those accused. The town streets, once peaceful, now echoed with the cries of those who had been dragged from their homes, their lives forever altered by the mere whisper of suspicion. Neighbors eyed one another with distrust, and families turned against each other in fear that someone close to them might be in league with the devil. As the witch hunts raged, the accusations spiraled out of control. No one was immune. Peasants, merchants, clergy, and even children were all caught in the deadly web. Entire families were implicated, their names added to the ever-growing lists of those to be tried and executed. The afflicted children, still under the grip of their supposed possessions, pointed their fingers at those they believed were responsible for their torment. The devil, they said, had promised them salvation in exchange for their souls, and the witches among them had led the way. The trial records reveal a chilling pattern. Confessions, extracted under the brutal lash of torture, were filled with vivid details of black Sabbaths, pacts with demons, and blasphemous rites. The accused, after enduring days of agony, would finally break and admit to crimes they could not possibly have committed. Some claimed they had flown on the backs of demons, others that they had seen the Virgin Mary herself defiled in satanic rituals. Yet these confessions were often riddled with inconsistencies and incoherence, the product of minds shattered by fear and pain. The pace of executions in Würzburg was relentless. The condemned were paraded through the streets, shackled and bruised, their eyes hollow from days of torture. In the town square, massive stakes were erected, their blackened tips piercing the sky like grim reminders of what awaited the accused. It was here, before the eyes of the entire town, that the witches of Würzburg were burned. The smell of burning flesh became an all-too-familiar stench in the city. Eyewitness accounts describe the sheer scale of the executions. On some days, dozens of men, women, and even children were burned in a single afternoon. Smoke from the pyres filled the air, a constant reminder of the supposed evil that had infected Würzburg. The people watched in silence as flames consumed their fellow citizens, their fear too great to allow even the faintest whisper of doubt. One of the most tragic aspects of the Würzburg trials was the number of children who were accused and executed. Innocent in every way, but guilty by association, many were implicated because of their families' confessions. Court records show that some of the accused were as young as 7 or 8 years old, their tiny bodies unable to withstand the horrors inflicted upon them. They too were burned at the stake, their lives snuffed out in a blind, irrational frenzy to cleanse the town of its perceived demonic threat. By the time the madness subsided, Würzburg was forever changed. Hundreds of lives had been taken. Some estimates placed the number as high as 900 souls, and the town itself had been scarred by the flames of hysteria. Among those executed were children, clergy, and respected members of society. In the eyes of the survivors, no one had been safe from the devil's grip. Church records from the time reveal just how widespread the accusations were. Entire families were wiped out in a single sweep, their names blotted from the town's history, their legacies reduced to ash. Contemporary chroniclers, like the Jesuit priest Friedrich Spee, who witnessed the horrors firsthand, were left to question the very nature of the trials. Spee, who ministered to the condemned, later wrote of his deep revulsion at the senseless bloodshed, remarking that innocence had been sacrificed to satisfy the madness of the age. When the executions finally ceased, the town of Würzburg was a shell of its former self. The fear that had driven so many to accuse their neighbors, to betray their loved ones, had left a stain on the town's soul. For years, the memories of the witch trials haunted the survivors, of the flames that consumed the innocent, of the faces of the possessed children, and of the prince bishop who had unleashed hell upon them. Chapter 3. The Convulsionaries of Saint Medard. It began in the shadowy silence of a graveyard. In 1731, the death of François de Paris, a devout Jansenist deacon, turned the peaceful cemetery of Saint Medard in Paris into the center of an unholy spectacle. His tomb, nestled quietly beneath the stone walls of the church, would become the epicenter of something far more terrifying than simple mourning. The ground around his grave trembled, but not with the grief of the faithful. Soon, it would pulse with the frenetic energy of those who claimed to be touched by divine power, yet seemed more possessed by something darker. Crowds gathered at the tomb of Paris, believing him to be a saint capable of working miracles from beyond the grave. And then, something strange began to happen. People fell to the ground, their bodies contorting violently, seizing in unnatural rhythms. They claimed to feel the divine coursing through their veins, but their movements were more akin to a demonic frenzy. These were not gentle displays of piety. They were grotesque, disturbing exhibitions of human bodies turned into vessels of something otherworldly. The first report spoke of women who, in moments of prayer before the tomb, suddenly collapsed, thrashing and shaking in ways that no physician could explain. Their limbs twisted into impossible angles, their heads jerked back as if unseen hands had taken control of their very bones. Eyewitnesses described their bodies as being bent double, their feet striking their own faces with the force of hammers. Doctors who witnessed these early convulsions stood helpless. Medical records from the time described the convulsions as beyond the scope of natural causes. The afflicted were not simply fainting or suffering from fits. Their strength was terrifying, their cries unnerving, and they showed no sign of pain despite the violent movements that racked their bodies. But this was only the beginning. What started as isolated incidents soon spread like wildfire. The faithful came in droves, and as the frenzy escalated, so too did the strange, disturbing displays. The convulsions became more violent, the actions of the possessed more bizarre. As the crowd swelled, the cemetery of Saint Medard became a theater of chaos. Some of the possessed claimed they felt divine healing in the convulsions, while others were overtaken by a fury that seemed nothing short of supernatural. Women screamed in voices that sounded inhuman, as though something ancient and malevolent had taken hold of their tongues. Among the most terrifying acts were those of the convulsionaries, a name given to the most extreme among the possessed. These individuals sought out pain, demanding to be struck, beaten, and tortured in front of the gathering crowds. They believed that such suffering would unlock divine ecstasy, and so they begged their followers to lash them with whips, strike them with stones, and even break their bones. Eyewitnesses stood aghast as the convulsionaries subjected themselves to barbaric acts. One woman was struck with a heavy iron bar more than 600 times, according to reports, her body absorbing each blow without a single cry of pain. Another man had nails driven into his hands, mimicking the wounds of Christ. He stood motionless, blood streaming from his palms, his face a mask of eerie calm. It wasn't long before the frenzy escalated into full-scale public exorcisms. Priests were called to drive out what many feared were demons, not angels, that had taken hold of these poor souls. But the exorcisms themselves were spectacles, often failing to calm the convulsions and instead seeming to whip the possessed into greater fits of hysteria. Some among the faithful were not content to merely witness the convulsions. They wanted to join in. And in this mass contagion of madness, the cemetery grounds transformed into a battlefield of flesh and spirit. Those afflicted became known as martyrs of Saint Medard, as they believed their suffering would bring them closer to God. Their cries echoed in the night, prayers turning to howls as they writhed on the ground. Some of the possessed exhibited signs of stigmata, bleeding from their hands and feet as though reliving the crucifixion. Others experienced visions of hell, describing shadowy figures clawing at their bodies, dragging them toward infernal depths. It was during one of these frenzied episodes that an extraordinary event was recorded. A young woman, seemingly possessed, was seen to rise from the ground, her body levitating above the tomb of Perry. Witnesses described the scene in breathless detail. Her limbs were rigid, her eyes rolled back into her head, and an eerie, guttural voice escaped her lips, speaking in tongues no one could understand. Doctors, priests, and laypeople all stood transfixed, unable to explain the phenomena. Could it be the power of God? Or had the devil finally claimed the souls of the faithful? The scenes of hysteria at St. Medard could not go unnoticed for long. As the months passed and the convulsions grew in intensity and number, local authorities and the church began to take notice. What had begun as a seemingly miraculous display of faith had become a public spectacle that threatened to undermine the very fabric of society. In 1732, the king himself was made aware of the events, and an order was issued to close the cemetery of St. Medard to the public. No longer would the faithful be allowed to gather at the tomb of Perry. But even this drastic measure could not stop the fervor. Defiantly, the possessed and their followers chanted in protest, and in the dead of night, they snuck into the cemetery, continuing their convulsions in secret. On the gates of St. Medard, someone scrawled an infamous inscription: "By order of the king, God is forbidden to perform miracles here." Yet, the convulsions did not cease. The fanaticism that had overtaken the followers of Perry spread beyond the walls of the cemetery, infecting other parts of Paris. The frenzy continued in homes, in the streets, wherever the faithful gathered. And with each passing day, the boundary between divine ecstasy and demonic possession blurred even further. The convulsionaries of St. Medard eventually faded into history, but their legacy left an indelible mark on Paris. The church, eager to distance itself from the scandal, issued a series of edicts to suppress any further gatherings. Priests who had once encouraged the convulsions were silenced, and exorcisms were no longer performed at the tomb of Perry. Medical records from the time reveal that many of the afflicted suffered long-term consequences from their ordeal. Some were permanently disfigured, their bodies broken by the relentless violence they had endured. Others were left mentally scarred, their minds twisted by the horrors they had lived through. Chapter 4. The Salem Witch Trials. In the frigid winter of 1692, the quiet Puritan town of Salem, Massachusetts, was gripped by a terror unlike any it had known before. The year would be remembered not for the bitter cold, but for the insidious forces that seemed to crawl into the very souls of its people. It began with a few whispers, but it soon grew into a scream that echoed through the streets, sending Salem spiraling into a nightmare of accusations, possession, and death. At the center of the storm were Reverend Samuel Parris and his own household. It was in his home that the first signs of the evil emerged. His daughter, Betty Parris, and niece, Abigail Williams, both young girls, began to display strange and terrifying behaviors. They writhed on the floor, contorting their bodies in ways that no human should be able to. Their eyes bulged with terror, their mouths filled with sounds that no one recognized. The girls screamed of invisible hands pinching and slapping them, and their fits grew worse with each passing day. It wasn't long before other girls in Salem began to suffer the same afflictions. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and Mary Walcott soon joined the growing number of those writhing and crying out in the grip of unseen forces. In the Puritan belief system, such behaviors were not the result of sickness or madness. They were the marks of the devil. The afflicted girls spoke of tormentors, shadowy figures who visited them in the dead of night, whispering unholy things and pressing down upon their chests as they slept. They named the women who came to them in these terrible visions. Witches, they said, who had sold their souls to Satan. Fear spread through Salem like wildfire. The devil was here, among them, and his servants had taken up residence in the bodies of their neighbors. Panic set in. Who could be trusted? Who might fall next into the thrall of the devil's grip? In late February, the afflicted girls named the first of many who would come to be accused of witchcraft. Among the accused was Tituba, an enslaved woman in the household of Reverend Parris. The girls claimed she was responsible for their torment, that she had bewitched them with her Caribbean magic. Tituba confessed under duress, telling wild tales of visions involving black dogs, yellow birds, and a man dressed all in black, a man she said was the devil himself. Her confession sent shockwaves through the town and confirmed the worst fears of the people of Salem. If Tituba was a witch, there must be others among them. Along with Tituba, 2 other women were singled out: Sarah Good, a beggar woman of ill repute, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly and sickly woman who had not attended church in years. These 3 women were the first to stand trial, but they would not be the last. Their trials, held before local magistrates, were filled with a terror that electrified the small courtroom. The afflicted girls, convulsing and shrieking, claimed they could see the spectral forms of the accused hovering above them, pinching and biting them even as they spoke. The people of Salem, gripped by religious fervor and the overwhelming fear of the devil, believed every word. The spectral evidence claims that the accused witches sent their spirits to torment their victims was enough to condemn them. All 3 women were sent to jail, but for Salem, this was just the beginning. By spring, the witchcraft hysteria had consumed Salem. The number of the accused grew daily. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and families were torn apart by suspicion. Reverend Samuel Parris stoked the flames from his pulpit, preaching of a town under siege by Satan himself. His sermons filled the minds of the townsfolk with visions of hell and eternal damnation, pushing them further into madness. It wasn't just the poor or the outcast who were accused. Soon, respectable members of the community found themselves dragged before the courts. Martha Corey, a woman of strong moral standing and a member of the church, was accused of witchcraft after expressing doubt about the legitimacy of the trials. Her disbelief only sealed her fate. If she questioned the existence of witchcraft, surely she must be in league with the devil. Rebecca Nurse, a deeply pious and elderly woman, was also accused. Despite her frail condition and her reputation as a godly woman, she was brought to trial. Her case shook the community, for if someone as saintly as Rebecca Nurse could be accused, then no one was safe. By the summer of 1692, a special court was established to deal with the mounting accusations, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Presiding over the court was Judge Samuel Sewell, along with other local officials. The trials became a spectacle, with the afflicted girls convulsing and screaming in the courtroom as they pointed to invisible specters they claimed were sent by the accused to torment them. One by one, those accused of witchcraft were convicted and sentenced to death. The primary method of execution was hanging, and it was in the town of Salem that the gallows claimed its victims. On June 10th, Bridget Bishop, the first to be hanged, was led to the scaffold. She had maintained her innocence throughout the trial, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. The crowd watched in silence as the noose was placed around her neck, and with a sharp drop, her body swung lifelessly in the wind. Over the course of the summer and into the fall, 19 more people would follow her, their deaths carried out under the heavy pall of superstition and fear. One of the most haunting stories from the Salem trials is that of Giles Corey, an elderly farmer who refused to enter a plea when he was accused of witchcraft. For his defiance, he was subjected to pain forte et dure, an excruciating form of torture in which heavy stones were piled on top of his body in an attempt to force a confession. The weight of the stones crushed his chest, but Corey remained silent. As more rocks were added, his final words were not a confession, but a defiant curse. More weight. He died under the crushing pressure, but his silence spoke louder than any of the confessions extracted under duress. As the executions continued, a sense of unease began to settle over Salem. Some of the more prominent voices in the colony, such as Increase Mather, began to speak out against the trials. He cautioned against the use of spectral evidence, warning that the devil could easily manipulate visions to deceive the innocent. His words gained traction, and the hysteria that had gripped Salem for months slowly began to wane. In October 1692, Governor William Phipps, responding to growing public concern, dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer. A new court was formed, and this time, spectral evidence was no longer allowed. With this shift, The trials came to an end, but not before 20 people had been executed and many more imprisoned. Chapter 5. The Possessions at Morzine. The quiet village of Morzine, nestled in the French Alps, seemed the least likely place for an encounter with the demonic. Isolated from the bustling cities, it was a community of simple farmers and devout Catholics, living in peace amid the towering mountains. But in 1857, a darkness crept into the village, one that would not lift for over a decade. What began with strange, unsettling behavior from a handful of villagers soon spiraled into a full-blown outbreak of possessions that threatened to tear the town apart. For 13 years, Morzine became a place where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural dissolved, leaving terror in its wake. It started slowly, with whispers and rumors of strange happenings. In the beginning, the villagers didn't talk openly about it, brushing off the strange occurrences as fits of hysteria or illness. But soon, the eerie behavior became impossible to ignore. Women, mostly young girls, began exhibiting symptoms that no one could explain. They would fall into sudden trances, their bodies convulsing violently, their eyes rolling back into their heads. They muttered incoherently in voices that seemed not their own, deep, guttural tones that didn't belong to the girls of Morzine. The first to be affected was a girl named Marie, known in the village for her piety. One evening, as she prayed in the small stone chapel, witnesses reported that she suddenly collapsed. Her body twisted unnaturally, her limbs flailing as though under the control of an unseen force. Her eyes bulged with terror, and she began screaming, claiming that demons had entered her soul. Her voice, those who heard it said, was not her own. It was rough, masculine, and filled with a hatred that sent chills through the air. Marie's family, desperate to understand what was happening, summoned Father Tyrant, the local priest. He had lived in Morzine for years, tending to the villagers' spiritual needs, but he had never seen anything like this. Father Tyrant attempted to perform a simple blessing, but Marie lashed out, screaming obscenities, writhing in agony. As he sprinkled holy water on her, she reacted violently, her body contorting with a strength that belied her small frame. What was happening in Morzine could not be contained to Marie alone. Soon, other girls in the village began showing the same signs. The possession spread like an infection. Within months, dozens of villagers, mostly women, were experiencing the same terrifying symptoms. They convulsed, shrieked, and claimed to be tormented by demonic entities. They cursed the priests, blaspheming against God in voices that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Panic gripped the village. The afflicted women accused their neighbors of witchcraft, saying they had summoned demons to possess them. The atmosphere in Morzine became suffocating, thick with fear and suspicion. No one knew who might be next to fall under the spell of the demons that seemed to lurk around every corner. As the possessions intensified, so did the villagers' desperation for answers. Father Tyrant tried to intervene, performing exorcisms on those he believed were truly possessed. These exorcisms were violent, terrifying affairs. The possessed would writhe on the ground, screaming as though they were being physically tortured by invisible hands. The priest recited prayers, invoked the saints, and brandished holy relics, but in many cases his efforts seemed to only provoke the demons further. The screams of the possessed echoed through the village, turning Morzine from a peaceful mountain town into a place of nightmarish dread. As the possessions persisted, word of the strange happenings in Morzine spread beyond the village. In 1861, the French government sent doctors to investigate the bizarre phenomenon. They hoped that science could offer a rational explanation for the terrifying events that had gripped the village. The doctors were skeptical of demonic possession, instead attributing the symptoms to mass hysteria or a kind of collective madness. Medical reports from the time describe, in chilling detail, what the doctors witnessed. They documented the convulsions, the screaming fits, and the strange behaviors of the afflicted. Some of the possessed seemed to possess unnatural strength, throwing themselves violently against walls or contorting their bodies in impossible ways. Others exhibited signs of what the doctors called demonic mania, uncontrollable laughter, growling, and the speaking of languages they could not possibly know. Despite the doctor's presence, the possessions did not stop. In fact, the arrival of outsiders seemed to further inflame the situation. The afflicted grew more agitated, claiming that the demons within them were angered by the interference. The village continued to spiral into chaos, torn between those who believed in a supernatural explanation and those who sought a scientific one. As the possessions dragged on into the 1860s, the church could no longer ignore the growing crisis in Morzine. Father Tyrant had done what he could, but it was clear that this was no ordinary spiritual battle. In 1864, the church sent a team of exorcists to the village, determined to rid Morzine of the demonic forces that seemed to have taken root. The exorcisms were brutal and terrifying. The afflicted were dragged to the church, where they were subjected to hours of prayers, chants, and blessings. Holy water was poured over their bodies, and the exorcists shouted prayers into their ears, demanding that the demons reveal themselves and depart. The possessed reacted with screams, violent thrashing, and threats. Some spat at the priests, others barked and howled like animals. One woman, overcome by the exorcism, ripped at her own flesh until she was covered in blood. Yet despite the exorcisms, the possessions did not cease. The spirits, it seemed, were not so easily banished. By 1865, the situation had become so dire that the church declared Morzine a place of special spiritual intervention. The local bishop ordered that all the possessed women be confined to their homes, where they were to be kept under constant supervision and subject to regular exorcisms. Church authorities were brought in to investigate the root cause of the possessions, hoping to find some explanation, spiritual or otherwise, that could put an end to the madness. In 1869, after years of suffering, the possessions finally began to subside. Some of the afflicted women, exhausted by the years of torment, were finally able to return to their normal lives. Others, however, were never the same, their minds and bodies broken by years of violent possession. The village of Morzine, once a peaceful mountain community, had been forever scarred by the horrors that had taken place. The possessions of Morzine were never fully explained. Medical reports, church documents, and eyewitness testimonies offer different perspectives, but none provide a definitive answer. Was it mass hysteria brought on by religious fervor and fear? Or had the village truly been overrun by demonic forces, as the possessed had claimed? Chapter 6, the St. Vitus Dance. The 16th century in Europe was a time of profound superstition, religious fervor, and a deep fear of the unseen forces that were believed to stalk the earth. It was also a time of inexplicable madness, and in certain towns, a terrifying phenomenon gripped entire populations. Villages were swept by uncontrollable dancing, with men, women, and children alike falling into a frantic, often fatal, frenzy. To those who watched helplessly, it seemed as though these unfortunate souls were in the grip of demonic possession, cursed by some malevolent force. In reality, something far more insidious and far more earthly may have been at work. Let's delve into the bizarre outbreaks of St. Vitus Dance, or dancing mania that ravaged parts of Europe, events that have confounded historians and scientists alike. While some blamed demonic possession, others sought a more rational explanation, and eventually, centuries later, the theory of ergot poisoning would offer a chilling possibility. The first reports of mass dancing began in the early 1500s. Towns across Europe, from France to the Rhine regions of Germany, reported disturbing incidents of groups of people suddenly breaking into wild, uncontrollable dance in the streets. The first sign that something was wrong would often come in the form of a lone figure, shuffling awkwardly, their limbs jerking unnaturally, as though being tugged by invisible strings. Their face would contort, twisted with a blend of fear and ecstasy. Soon, others would follow, until entire groups of villagers were caught in this macabre dance. The dancers seemed to lose all sense of control, flinging their bodies into bizarre and grotesque contortions, their eyes wide with terror or glazed over in a trance-like state. They would dance for hours, sometimes for days, until their feet bled and their bodies gave out from sheer exhaustion. Some would collapse, writhing on the ground, while others continued to dance until they dropped dead from heart failure or stroke. Witnesses described the scenes with a mixture of horror and awe. The afflicted, they said, were clearly not in control of their own bodies. They moved like marionettes, as though possessed by demonic spirits that drove them to the brink of madness and beyond. Local religious leaders, too, were at a loss. Many saw the dancing as a sign of divine punishment, or, worse yet, an invasion of demonic forces into their once peaceful communities. In an age where religion held ultimate authority, the church was quick to act. The Catholic Church named the condition after Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr who had long been associated with the protection against diseases of the nervous system. Some believed that the afflicted had fallen under the curse of Saint Vitus himself, while others were convinced they were witnessing cases of outright demonic possession. In response to the dancing, priests organized mass prayers and exorcisms in the hopes of driving out the evil spirits that had taken hold of the afflicted. Crosses were carried through the streets, and holy water was sprinkled on the dancers, but to no avail. The convulsions continued unabated, the dancing spreading like a plague from one town to the next. In some cases, the church resorted to extreme measures. Entire villages were marched to nearby shrines dedicated to Saint Vitus, where they would beg for forgiveness and divine intervention. The afflicted were made to perform religious penance, fasting, and whipping themselves in hopes that their suffering would drive away whatever dark forces had possessed them. But the dancing persisted, sometimes vanishing as mysteriously as it had begun, only to reappear months or even years later in a new town. Physicians of the time were equally baffled. Lacking modern medical knowledge, many believed the dancing was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors or a kind of nervous disorder. Treatments were often as brutal as they were ineffective: bleeding, purging, or even the application of red-hot irons to drive out the evil. In some cases, the afflicted were isolated, chained in dark cells, or confined to asylums, where they were left to die in their madness. Contemporary medical records tell of doctors who were just as terrified as the villagers. They watched helplessly as the mania spread through entire communities, leaving chaos in its wake. Some doctors began to suspect that the real cause was not spiritual, but rather something material, a poison or disease that had infected the nervous system and driven people to madness. But without the scientific tools to investigate further, their theories remained speculative at best. Centuries later, a chilling explanation for the dancing mania would emerge, one rooted not in the supernatural, but in the very earth itself. In the 20th century, historians began to link the outbreaks of St. Vitus dance to ergot poisoning, a condition caused by the ingestion of ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on rye and other grains in damp conditions. Ergot poisoning, also known as St. Anthony's fire, can cause terrifying symptoms, including violent convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene. The fungus contains alkaloids similar to LSD, which can induce powerful hallucinations and erratic behavior. In an era where bread made from rye was a staple of the European diet, a contaminated batch of grain could easily spread the toxin to an entire village, leading to the strange behavior that was mistaken for demonic possession. Historians combed through medical records, contemporary chronicles, and even weather reports from the time, piecing together a chilling pattern. Many of the towns that reported outbreaks of dancing mania had also experienced particularly wet growing seasons, which would have created the perfect conditions for ergot to thrive. The townsfolk, unknowingly ingesting the contaminated grain, would have been subjected to the toxin's effects, their minds and bodies thrown into chaos. While the ergot poisoning theory remains one of the most plausible explanations for the dancing plagues, it does not erase the horror of what those communities endured. Whether driven mad by poison or possessed by demons, the villagers believed they were in the grip of something far beyond their control, something dark and malevolent. The outbreaks of dancing mania eventually faded from memory, but they left a lasting legacy of fear and superstition. Even today, the thought of entire towns convulsing in unison, their bodies twisted by some unseen force, sends shivers down the spine. The specter of St. Vitus' dance continues to haunt the darker corners of European history, a reminder that the line between the natural and supernatural is often thinner than we would like to believe. The dances may have ended, but the fear remains. Chapter 7. The Tarantism Epidemic in Southern Italy. In the sun-scorched villages of southern Italy, something sinister slithered beneath the surface of everyday life. The heat was oppressive, and the air thick with superstition. For centuries, the people of Apulia, a rugged region in Italy, lived in terror of an enemy they believed could strike at any moment, unseen and unprovoked. This enemy was not a demon in the traditional sense, but a creature far more earthly, an innocent-looking spider known as the tarantula. Legend said that the bite of this spider was no mere physical wound. It was a curse, a venom that seeped into the very soul of its victims, driving them to madness. This affliction, known as tarantism, was said to possess those bitten, forcing them into violent fits of dancing, delirium, and sometimes death. For over 200 years, from the 15th to the 17th century, waves of this strange, frenzied behavior swept across southern Italy. The outbreaks left villagers stricken with terror as loved ones succumbed to a mysterious madness that defied all reason. The stories all began the same way. A man or woman working in the fields would suddenly collapse, clutching their leg or arm, claiming to have been bitten by a tarantula. What followed was nothing short of horrifying. Their limbs would begin to shake uncontrollably, and a feverish delirium would seize their minds. Eyewitnesses described how the afflicted would scream in pain, their bodies convulsing violently as though something evil had taken hold of them. But the true horror came later. After the initial bite, the victims of tarantism were said to be gripped by an overwhelming, unstoppable urge to dance. They would begin to twist and thrash, often with no rhythm or reason, their faces contorted in expressions of fear and ecstasy. The dance would grow more frenzied, their bodies flailing in unnatural movements, and they seemed to be unable to stop themselves. Onlookers spoke of how the victims would dance until their feet bled, until their muscles gave out, and their hearts threatened to burst. Faced with this terror, the people of southern Italy turned to whatever means they could to rid themselves of the curse. They believed that only music and movement could purge the venom from the body, and so the victims of tarantism were subjected to strange, feverish rituals in an attempt to cure them. Musicians would be summoned to play lively tunes on tambourines, lutes, and violins, in the hopes that the music would calm the afflicted and force the poison to leave their bodies. Crowds would gather in the village squares, watching in awe and horror as the bitten danced for hours on end. These scenes were chaotic and haunting, half exorcism, half folk festival. The musicians played frantically, their eyes fixed on the afflicted, who danced in grotesque convulsions, their bodies seemingly torn between life and death. Often, several victims would join in, turning the square into a nightmarish whirl of limbs and cries. It was said that each individual tarantula had its own unique cure, a specific melody that could break the spider's spell. The challenge for the musicians was to find the right tune that matched the venom. This was no easy task, and so the frenzied dancing could last for hours, sometimes even days, as the victims sought the melody that would save them. The longer the cure evaded them, the more desperate and violent the dancing became. As the epidemic of tarantism spread, the church grew concerned. While many priests viewed the phenomenon as the work of demonic forces, others believed that the victims were genuinely sick, stricken by some unknown physical ailment. Yet, as with so many things in that era, the line between religion and superstition was blurred. Exorcisms were often performed alongside the musical rituals. Priests would sprinkle holy water on the afflicted and chant prayers over their writhing bodies, hoping to drive out whatever malevolent spirit had taken hold. In some instances, holy relics were pressed to the dancer's skin, and special masses were held in their name. But, as with the music, the success of these spiritual interventions was unpredictable. There were cases where the dancing stopped abruptly, the victim collapsing in exhaustion, claiming to be cured. But there were also cases where the convulsions continued, even in the presence of holy figures, leaving the priests shaken and the villagers even more convinced that they were witnessing something truly demonic. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, cases of tarantism continued to baffle doctors and religious figures alike. Medical reports from the time described the symptoms in detail: muscle spasms, fever, hallucinations, and uncontrollable dancing. Yet no clear explanation could be found. Many physicians believed the cause to be a combination of heat, malnutrition, and exhaustion, while others supported the idea that the bite of the tarantula truly did contain some toxic element that affected the nervous system. But for the people of Apulia, no medical explanation was needed. To them, tarantism was a curse, a manifestation of the evil that lurked in the shadows of their everyday lives. Some victims would reportedly dance for weeks on end, only to die from sheer exhaustion, their bodies wrung out by whatever dark force had possessed them. Even when the afflicted survived, they were never the same again. Survivors of tarantism often spoke of visions they had experienced during their convulsions, visions of demonic creatures, of hellfire and shadowy figures that danced beside them. These tales only fueled the fear of the spider's bite, ensuring that future generations would continue to believe in its dark power. By the 17th century, as medical knowledge began to advance and society slowly moved away from its medieval superstitions, the tarantism epidemic began to fade. Doctors started to suggest that the affliction was less about spider venom and more about psychological and social factors. Some proposed that tarantism was a form of mass hysteria, triggered by the harsh conditions of rural life, intense summer heat, and the overwhelming fear of the supernatural that pervaded the region. In modern times, historians and medical experts have suggested that many of the symptoms of tarantism, hallucinations, convulsions, and violent dancing, may have been linked to ergot poisoning, a condition caused by consuming bread made from rye contaminated with a toxic fungus. This theory, however, does little to diminish the terrifying reality faced by those who lived through the epidemic. The tarantism epidemic left a lasting scar on southern Italy, its legacy woven into the region's folklore and cultural memory. Even today, traditional dances such as the tarantella, with their wild rhythmic movements, are said to have originated as a symbolic act of curing the spider's bite. The chilling stories of mass possession you've just explored are not distant nightmares. They're real, documented events that haunt our history. If these tales left you questioning the line between the supernatural and reality, we want to hear your thoughts. Share this audiobook with others and leave a comment to tell us what you think. Could such horrors happen again? Or are they merely echoes of the past? The conversation is just beginning. Join in and spread the terror.